But here's what I think that we need to learn from what Paul is saying here. Our burden for people needs to be much greater than what it is. Our burden for the souls of people. That's why we want you to have a passion for God. That's why we preach verse by verse through the Bible, because we want you to know God, because we want you to have a passion for God, because that will motivate you in all of your life. And we want you to have a passion for God because it will burden you for people. That's what a passion for God produces, a burden for people. And I know that today, I doubt any of us would say, I'll spend eternity in hell if a people group will come to Jesus. But I think it should challenge us to say our burden for people is not what we want it to be. You know, Paul says, I'll give my eternity. To be quite honest with you, I hope you get there one day to say that. I hope I get there one day. I don't know. I hope we could. But here's my prayer for LifePoint. My prayer is that LifePoint is full of people that when we look at Paul, who says, I'll give my eternity, I'll give my eternity in heaven, and I'll take eternity in hell. I'll give that away if people come to know Jesus. I just pray people at LifePoint will say, you know what, I want people to come to know Jesus so bad. I'm so burdened for them that I'll give my money. I'll give my time. I'll give my job if necessary, because you can be fired for preaching the gospel. So be it. I'll give my job. I'll give my reputation just so people can know Jesus. That's my prayer for LifePoint, is that we will be burdened for people so much that we will be willing to give what's necessary so that people come to know Jesus. And folks, I believe this passage also tells us that we should be passionate about sharing Jesus with those in our relational circle. You see, Paul was a Jew. The Jews were his affinity group, his relational affinity group, right? So we should be passionate about sharing Jesus with those in our relational affinity group. That doesn't mean that God will not call you, and I believe He is calling some of you to cross social, cultural, and linguistic barriers to share the gospel with the nations all over the world. As Dan and Liz are going to Brussels, that's a social, cultural, linguistic barrier. They're going to be speaking French. They're going to be in a different culture, a different social structure to share the gospel. God's calling some of you to do that, and when you do that, that's what He did for Paul. Paul was a Jew, and Paul went to the Gentiles. Social, linguistic, cultural barrier. He's calling some of you to do that, but He's calling 100% of every Christian to share with people in their relational affinity groups. And in Acts 1, He gives us a great commission before He jets back to heaven. He does in Matthew 28. He does in Acts 1. In Acts 1, He said it this way. He said, I'm going back to be with the Father. Jesus to His disciples. And to them specifically there, He said, don't leave Jerusalem until you receive the Holy Spirit. And then He speaks to all disciples, them and us, then and now. He says, you're going to receive the Holy Spirit. And He tells us why we're receiving the Holy Spirit. The reason I'm going to give you the Holy Spirit is to empower you to spread my fame, to be my witnesses all over the world. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. So he gives us Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Concentric circles, so to speak. And in other words, he says, the reason if you're a believer, I saved you is so that I can empower you to tell people about me. A passion for God produces a burden for people, and I'm empowering you to tell people about me. That's the reason I saved you. And he says, so tell Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. In other words, for us, that would be like, okay, tell people in your family, tell people in your neighborhood, tell people in your city, tell people in your state, tell people in your country, tell people around the nations. That's what that means. But it doesn't mean in succession. It doesn't mean, in other words, tell your family, and then after all your family knows, then tell people in your neighborhood, then after all the people in your neighborhood know, then tell your city, it doesn't mean succession, it means simultaneity. In other words, what Paul is or what Jesus is saying in Acts 1 when he goes, you need to be worried about those nearest to you and those farthest from you. He says you should be passionate about making sure Thais and Belge and Indian and Mexican and Brazilian and you name any people group, you should be passionate about all people knowing Jesus and those right in your front yard at the same time. You send people. You make sure you're interested in Thai and Belge by sending money, by sending people, by going on trips, by making sure how can we get the gospel to these people. And at the same point, you go right out the door and you begin to share your faith and you begin to tell people about Jesus Christ, because that's the burden that the passion of God produces, a burden for people. And so I think that's what Paul is saying here. And so, therefore, I think you need to have 8 to 10, as well as sending people like Dan and Liz, as well as you sharing the gospel. You need to have 8 to 10 people in your relational affinity group. Now, your relational affinity group, your family, it could be those at your workplace, those in your school, those friends that are at your school. If you're an athlete, the people at practice. If you're a cheerleader, those in your cheer squad. If you're a computer geek, those in your computer geek squad. Whatever. I mean, those are people in your affinity groups. You need to have 8 to 10 of those guys and gals written down that you're praying, God, save them, and please open the door and let me know how to walk through it and use me. And you need to have 8 to 10 people that you are really pouring into in those affinity groups. That's what we see Paul doing here. I'm a missionary. I'm the apostle to the Gentiles, but I am passionate about the Jews. I'm a missionary in India, but man, I'm passionate about those right here in Smyrna and Murfreesboro and Laverne. I'm passionate about those folks.